We've all got that one story. The one so crazy, so unbelievable, you can't help but share it every chance you get. Whether it's a bizarre coincidence, a brush with danger, or something straight out of a movie. What's your craziest story that you have to tell everybody? Welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Story 1. I was an exchange student in Poland a few years ago. I had just turned 18 and didn't have much experience with alcohol. About 3 weeks into school, we had a dance, which I decided to attend. It turned out to be very different from the school dances I was used to back in the US. First, it was held at a nightclub downtown, which felt a little strange but okay. Second, there was a bar. I was in the senior class, and since we were all 18, we were allowed to drink, but I wasn't quite ready for that. Third, I had just started smoking the week before. My high school had a designated smoking area, and about a third of my classmates smoked, so I figured I'd give it a try to fit in. All these things combined, and I ended up getting incredibly drunk. I blacked out for a bit, and when I came to, I found myself outside smoking with my friend. We decided to walk to a nearby 24-hour liquor store. I went in, clearly intoxicated, and bought a medium-sized bottle of vodka. The cashier hesitated, but when she heard I was American, she just shrugged and said, "Go ahead." After another couple of hours and another blackout, the police arrived. They were yelling at my class president for walking in the street. Drunk me, despite barely speaking any Polish, decided to step in. I approached the officer and tried to say, "Leave him alone," but instead, I ended up vomiting all over his boot. I thought to myself, this is it. I'm going to get arrested and deported. The officer looked at me, then asked, "You American?" "Yes, sir," I replied, already feeling like I was in big trouble. He glanced at me, looked at the bottle of vodka in my hand, and said, "You drink bad vodka. Come with me." He put me in the back of the police car and started driving away. I felt my heart drop. Just 3 weeks into what was supposed to be the best year of my life, and it seemed over. But then, he stopped 2 blocks later at the same 24-hour liquor store, took me inside, and bought me a small bottle of Zubrowka vodka. "This one's good and cheap. Welcome to Poland," he said. "Now let me take you back to your friends." As we returned to the club, he turned on the sirens and lights for fun, causing a group of kids to run down the street. He laughed uncontrollably, unlocked the car door, and as I climbed out, he shouted, "Be safe, friend." 20 minutes later, I blacked out again. When I woke up, I was lying on the kitchen floor of my host house, feeling terrible. My host mom made coffee and said, "Wow, looks like you had quite the night, huh?" And that, hands down, was the craziest night of my life. Story 2. My brother and I are fraternal twins. When we were about 15, our stepmom passed away from breast cancer. She had been a huge part of our lives, like a second mother, ever since we were 5. Fast forward to our junior year of college. I was attending school in upstate New York, and he was at a university in Florida. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat with tears streaming down my face. I just had the most vivid dream. I was in a house and my stepmom was there. In the dream, I knew she had passed away, which had never happened in any dream before. She hugged me, told me how handsome I'd become, and said she loved me. I woke up thinking, what was that? But didn't tell anyone and went to class. Later, while I was walking back to my apartment, I got a call from my brother. The first thing he said was, "I know this sounds weird, but I had the most vivid dream about Maggie last night." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as he described the exact same dream I'd had the night before. We'd never had a twin moment like that, and I still don't know what to make of it. But it's a story I've always felt was worth telling. Story 3. In high school and the few years after, I mainly made money by selling pot. One day, I was hanging out at home with my girlfriend, and we went to the nearby Circle K to grab some beer. The clerk, who I knew pretty well, asked if I could get him a dub sack. I said sure, took his cash, and went home, but completely forgot about it until an hour or 2 later. Finally, I waited out and headed back to meet him. When I got there, he had no customers, so we went around the back of the store, near the ice machine, and started chatting while I handed him the bag. The lot was pretty empty, except for a beat-up Volvo facing the record store next door. If I'd paid more attention, I might have noticed the weirdly tinted windows. Suddenly, 2 men got out of the Volvo and walked toward us. One was a tall, skinny guy in full denim, and the other looked like Dog the Bounty Hunter in a beige sweater. They casually asked us how we were doing, and the clerk and I exchanged a confused look. Neither of us knew them. Then, they flashed badges, yelled, "EPD!" "You're under arrest," cuffed us, separated us, and began searching us. Dog found some cash and questionable texts on my phone and started pressing me, asking if I'd been busy with sales. Then, the surprise. They walked me and my girlfriend back to my house, saying they'd seen me going in and out a lot and wanted to make sure there isn't a pound of heroin inside. They claimed if I cooperated, it'd just be a misdemeanor charge. Otherwise, I'd face jail and a felony. At this point, we were on my front porch, and I refused to let them in, repeatedly asking them to call my lawyer. Just then, my roommate walked out, casually said hi, got in his car, and left. That's when Dog warned that if I didn't let them in, he'd park squad cars on the lawn, get everyone out of the house, wait for a warrant, and charge us all with anything they found. I now know this wasn't legal, but back then, I was terrified, especially about my straight-edge roommate, who had a good job and could have lost it over this. Unfortunately, I had a recent steal of a deal on a quarter-pound of mushrooms that I'd already portioned out into ounces and ate. They were sitting right on my bedroom coffee table. On top of that, I had a stash of pot in there too. So, I proposed a compromise. I'd let one of them search just my bedroom. I knew this was risky, but I didn't see any other way out. Dog agreed, and while Canadian Tuxedo stayed with my girlfriend, Dog followed me upstairs. I led him past my closed bedroom door and into my straight-edge roommate's room instead. Dog searched every inch of it, flipping drawers, turning the mattress, and tearing the place up. Meanwhile, I quietly turned off the monitor displaying my roommate's screensaver, a photo of him and his girlfriend. After finding nothing, Dog stuck to our agreement and walked me back downstairs. My girlfriend looked like she'd seen a ghost, but I was relieved, grinning like an idiot. Even then, they still charged me with a felony. In the end, I paid a good attorney who had connections with the prosecutor. Since they hadn't seen any cash exchange, my charge was reduced to delivery of marijuana. The prosecutor recommended the minimum penalty, so I paid a $121 fine, did 80 hours of community service at a local music venue, where I got to see a ton of free shows, and officially retired from selling. Story 4. About 3 to 4 years ago, I was living in a large European city, about 2 million people, where I'd been for a few years. One night, I went to a pub with a girl, and since all the tables were full, we took seats at the bar. There was an older guy sitting next to me, around 50, white hair, smoking a cigar, who caught my attention because he reminded me of my uncle. Now, keep in mind, my uncle had been living in the US for over 25 years, didn't really look like this guy, and didn't have a similar personality. But there was just something about this man's gestures, mixed with a resemblance to another distant relative, that reminded me of him. While the girl I was with went to the bathroom, I couldn't hold back anymore. I looked over at him, and said he reminded me of my uncle. He jokingly asked, "What's his name?" So, I told him, adding, "Well, he lives in the US and works in field of work." At that, the guy looked totally stunned and then proceeded to name my entire family. It turns out he'd been my uncle's roommate about 30 years ago for half a year. That was definitely one of the weirdest bar stories I've ever experienced. Story 5. My brother and I are fraternal twins. When we were about 15, our stepmom passed away from breast cancer. She had been a huge part of our lives, like a second mother, ever since we were 5. Fast forward to our junior year of college. I was attending school in upstate New York, and he was at a university in Florida. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat with tears streaming down my face. I just had the most vivid dream. I was in a house, and my stepmom was there. In the dream, I knew she had passed away, which had never happened in any dream before. She hugged me, told me how handsome I'd become, and said she loved me. I woke up thinking, what was that? But didn't tell anyone and went to class. Later, while I was walking back to my apartment, I got a call from my brother. The first thing he said was, "I know this sounds weird, but I had the most vivid dream about Maggie last night." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as he described the exact same dream I'd had the night before. We'd never had a twin moment like that, and I still don't know what to make of it. But it's a story I've always felt was worth telling. Story 6. I was served lunch on a flight, and as I ate, I noticed the woman next to me gradually slowing down. Her movements became sluggish, cutting and chewing in slow motion. Then she just stopped altogether. She sat frozen, fork and knife in hand, head tilted down toward her plate, with half-cut food in front of her. She wasn't moving at all. I gently tapped her shoulder, gave a little nudge, and asked if she was okay. No reaction. I couldn't tell if she was breathing. Was that faint air conditioning or her breath? I had no idea. I didn't want to alarm everyone, so I discreetly made eye contact with a flight attendant and gestured toward the woman. Within minutes, 5 flight attendants, plus the co-pilot, formed a kind of barrier around our seats, and started trying to wake her, like a scene straight out of a movie. "Stay with us. Don't you die on me." Then, suddenly, the woman wakes up, glances up, and calmly says, "I took really strong sleeping pills." And just like that, she goes right back to sleep, in the exact same T-Rex pose, as if she knew she'd only be awake long enough to explain herself. So, for the remaining 6 to 7 hours of the flight, she sat there, hands still gripping her now-removed fork and knife, drooling slightly, like a snoozing T-Rex. And every person who walked by just looked at me with this puzzled expression. Best flight ever. Story 6. I once saved a man's life, and I never saw him again. 10 years later, it's still the craziest thing that's ever happened to me. In high school, I worked as a lifeguard at a country club to earn some summer cash. It was a relaxed job since it was members only, so most of my day was just learning names, chatting, and giving the usual "Good morning, Mr. Garrity" greetings. One 4th of July weekend, though, the pool was more crowded than usual. Each member could bring a guest. I noticed a middle-aged man I hadn't seen before. He was a big guy, over 6 feet and at least 230 pounds, doing gainers off the low dive, trying to make big splashes to entertain his friends. On one jump, he got a running start, slipped at the end of the board, and lost his balance. His body came off the board backward, and his head whipped back and hit the diving board with a sickening crack. I can still hear that sound in my head. From my lifeguard chair, I watched his body sink underwater, and in my head, I started counting. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. No movement. I blew 3 short whistles, the signal for the other guards to grab the neck board, and dove into the pool with my buoy. My training kicked in. I swam down 8 to 9 feet, grabbed him, and kicked us both up to the surface. He was completely limp, not breathing. With help from the other guards, I managed to get him onto the neck board. At this point, the crowd of shocked faces around us told me it was my show. I took a breath, shouted for someone to call an ambulance, and then made a choice. The board was meant to stabilize his neck in case of injury, but he wasn't breathing. I couldn't let him die, so I decided to do chest compressions. No one tells you how brutal chest compressions feel, bones and cartilage cracking under your hands. I did 1 round of 30 compressions and then gave him 2 breaths. His head slightly tilted on the board, so I didn't need to move his neck. After a few more compressions, a little water trickled out of his mouth. He coughed, and suddenly the other guards were lifting him away before I even processed what was happening. I rolled onto the concrete, heart pounding, ears ringing, trying to process it all. The whole thing probably took just 6 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. I stumbled over to the guard shack, dried off, and was taken to the club's main building. The manager, a friend's dad who had gotten me the job, sat down with me to go over the details. I signed some paperwork, still in a kind of daze, and was sent home for the day. When I came back a few days later, I heard from another guard that the guy was okay. The member who'd brought him as a guest thanked me, but I never saw that man again. It's still the wildest experience I've had. I'm glad my instincts took over and that my training was there when I needed it. I didn't do everything perfectly, but he survived. I hope he's doing well. Story 7. This story might be long, but the coincidence is incredible. I'm from a small province in the Philippines and moved to Manila to work in a call center right after college in 2007. I made a lot of friends there but left after 2 years because the graveyard shift just wasn't for me. Fast forward to 2013. My widowed mom, still in our province, met a French man through a mutual friend, and they hit it off. They got engaged in 2014 and soon after got married, planning to move back to France together. While they were organizing their move, I posted on social media asking if anyone knew of Filipino contacts in France to help my mom adjust. Out of the blue, an old colleague from that Manila call center reached out. She told me she had a Filipina friend, Rowena, who'd been living in France for over 20 years and might be able to help my mom settle in. I passed along Rowena's information, and my mom connected with her on Facebook. They started chatting and getting to know each other. One day, while on a Skype call with Rowena, they began talking about their husbands. My mom pulled out an old photo of her husband from his university days, a picture of him sitting on a couch with his best friend from back then. He hadn't seen his friend since graduation because they'd lost touch after each went abroad for work. The moment Rowena saw the picture, she gasped. "That's my husband sitting next to your husband," she exclaimed. She ran to her office and pulled out the exact same photo, which her husband had held onto for all those years. After the shock and a few tears, they realized they'd reunited 2 best friends who hadn't spoken in nearly 40 years. Story 8. For context, I'm a 19-year-old Scottish guy who was interrailing around Europe for a month. We were in Budapest for a few days, enjoying the clubs and parties. When it was time to leave, We decided to catch an early morning train to Split around 5 a.m. We had 2 taxis booked to take us to the train station, and we stumbled out, still half asleep, and started loading our stuff. While we were loading, we noticed 3 young guys sprinting down the street, yelling, "Run!" We laughed, thinking they were just having some drunken fun. But no, that was definitely not the case. Just as we got into our taxi, a guy covered in tattoos and someone else's blood approached my door and asked to shake my hand. Not wanting to offend this intense-looking guy, I shook his bloodied hand, and he wished me well. I thought I dodged a bullet. Then he tried to shake hands with our massive Bulgarian taxi driver, but the driver refused. As the driver backed out to leave, the guy lost it and started attacking the taxi. Elbows, fists, knees, the works. We started driving away, thinking he wouldn't bother chasing a moving car. Right? Wrong. This guy channeled some superhero speed and sprinted after us like he was in the Olympics, with this wild look in his eyes. Our driver turned a corner, but suddenly, a garbage truck was blocking the whole road. And here comes our tattooed friend around the corner, charging at us like a missile. Half asleep and panicking, I shouted, "Lock the doors," which, thankfully, the driver did. But it was no use. The guy started slamming his fists against the windows, blood smearing everywhere, and even ripped off one of the wing mirrors to use as a weapon. We were sitting in terror while our friends in the taxi behind us were cracking up, watching the whole nightmare unfold. Both taxi drivers eventually got out to try to handle him, and he spat in their faces, threw the wing mirror at them, and finally sprinted off. The craziest part? As he left, he politely apologized to a local who had been watching the entire scene in shock. Story 9. This is a long story from the early 1980s, full of what I can only call Kentucky justice. My family lived just outside Cincinnati, on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River. My dad's older brother, my uncle, lived nearby and was the father of 4 daughters. One of his daughters, around 18 at the time, started dating a guy a bit older than her who eventually convinced her to move down south with him. With my uncle's blessing, she headed off with her boyfriend to a secluded Kentucky holler where his family lived. After some time passed without hearing from her, my uncle started to worry. Then, out of the blue, my cousin called him from a payphone at a grocery store, distressed and saying she was being mistreated and kept as a virtual prisoner, forced to work in terrible conditions by her boyfriend's family. Before he could get more details, the call abruptly cut off. My uncle, a big man known for his temper and love of hunting, was not about to let this slide. He told his wife and other daughters what was going on, packed up his Oldsmobile Delta 88 with his favorite guns, and set out to find his daughter. Driving deep into rural Kentucky, where there were only dirt roads and family farms, he eventually found the farmhouse as night was falling. When he pulled up, he saw the boyfriend's family on the porch, firing shotguns into the air to intimidate him. But my uncle was not one to back down. He parked his car a good 50 yards away, popped the trunk, and lined his rifles across the hood, one by one, facing the house, preparing himself like a scene from an action movie. Then, in a voice that could have shaken the trees, he shouted, "If my daughter isn't down here in 5 minutes, I'm coming up there, and I'll deal with every single one of you." The boyfriend and his brothers immediately ran inside, and not even a minute later, my cousin came running out with her suitcase, ready to go home. In another story about the same uncle, he was driving across a narrow bridge over a small river, one where only one car could pass at a time. He came face to face with a pickup truck full of 3 locals, honking and yelling for him to back up. True to form, my uncle refused, and he got out of his car, intending to intimidate them. One of the men yelled, "You don't scare us, there's 3 of us." And my uncle, calm as could be, replied, "Do all 3 of you know how to swim?" That was enough to make them back up and let him pass. Story 10. A little while ago, my roommate was approached by a wealthy man in the area with an unusual proposition. He offered to pay her to be his live-in pet for a month. At first, she assumed it was a playful way of suggesting a sugar daddy/baby type arrangement. However, the reality was quite different. He was offering room and board, along with a very generous allowance, in exchange for her spending a significant portion of her day dressed as a cat. This included walking on all 4s, eating from a bowl, using a litter box, and even sleeping in a small cage at night. There were no sexual expectations. He was simply looking for a human cat for the duration of the month. After carefully considering the offer over the weekend, she ultimately decided to decline, politely. Story 11. I work as a team leader at a supermarket and, being a social person, I always try to make new employees feel welcome and comfortable. There was a new guy, around 19 years old, who was very quiet. He only spoke when spoken to, and no one really made an effort to talk to him. So, I decided to reach out. I was kind to him, but at first, he wasn't very approachable. Over the weeks, he warmed up and started being friendly in return. However, no one else at work made an effort to engage with him. I didn't think much of it, but I later learned why he left after just 3 months. It turned out he was doing community service as part of a legal requirement. He had a criminal record, and the supermarket had hired him at a reduced salary, paying him half of what they would pay a regular employee. Fast forward about a year, I was out at a bar when some drunk guys started a fight with me. It wasn't a big deal at first, but as I was leaving, I noticed 5 of them waiting for me outside. I didn't want to involve my friend, so I just tried to walk away, ignoring them. But they blocked my way and stopped me, clearly intending to cause trouble. That's when I saw the guy from the supermarket, along with his group of friends. 6 guys, all aged between 21 to 25, stepped in and came to my rescue. They confronted the drunk guys, asking them, "Tell us why we shouldn't mess you up right now." The troublemakers quickly backed off, and I couldn't thank my old coworker and his friends enough. After that, we went our separate ways, but whenever I run into him, we exchange a knowing nod. Story 12. When I was learning to fly at a less-than-reliable flight school, I was doing a pre-flight check on a Cessna, nearing the end of my training. I was performing the run-up when I noticed an odd smell. "Do you smell that?" "It smells like fuel," I said. The instructor, a young guy around 21, just shrugged. Irritated, I opened the door and saw a growing puddle of aviation fuel underneath the plane. "Oh no," I thought. The instructor panicked, saying, "Stay in the plane, I'll get help," and quickly ran off. Once the engine was off, I decided it was best to get out of the plane. I watched from a distance as the plane ended up dumping its fuel on the runway. The school kindly provided me with a different plane and instructor, and they claimed they'd fixed the original plane. A month later, I saw a news report about that same plane crashing due to fuel issues, resulting in 1 fatality. The company faced no major consequences. Story 13. I'm from Belgium and traveled a lot with my parents when I was younger. Later, when I was with my ex-girlfriend, we traveled a lot together as well, but neither of us had ever been to the USA. So, we told a couple of friends about it, and after a few beers, we started planning a trip together. Another mutual friend was studying in Philadelphia, so we figured we might as well visit him while we were there. We first went to New York and Philly for a few days, then flew to LA. From there, we rented a car and took a road trip through California, Nevada, and Utah. Along the way, we often joked about some of the quirky things we had seen or heard about people doing in the US. We especially had a lot of fun making jokes about small towns and their strange activities. After visiting Sequoia National Park, we were looking for a place to spend the night and grab some food. We found a rustic farmhouse where we could stay in one of the refurbished cabins, and asked the old woman who rented it to us where we could get a meal. The town, Pinehurst, was tiny and had almost no population. She pointed us to the Pinehurst Lodge, which was really the only spot for miles. We went there, had a great meal, and decided to grab a drink and play pool. While we were playing, an older, large man approached us. He was wearing a denim shirt with a George W. Bush picture and an eagle on it, and had a bushy mustache. He looked pretty tough, and we thought he might give us a hard time about using the pool table or laughing too much. But he turned out to be one of the kindest people we'd met. He asked if he could join us and bought us moonshine, which we thought was hilarious, and we bought him a few beers in return. We were having a blast. While we were playing and chatting, the phone behind the bar kept ringing, but we weren't paying attention to it. Around 11:30 p.m., a woman suddenly barged in with a gun in her hand. She looked at us, then stormed over to the man we had been talking to. My heart skipped a beat. She grabbed an empty beer bottle and smashed it over his head. We were all frozen in confusion as she started shouting at him and hitting him. He stayed calm, told her to relax, then turned to us, shook our hands, and said we should let him know if we ever came back so we could hang out again. He then walked outside with the woman. We stood there, still processing what had just happened. The bartender looked at us and said, "That's his wife. He's a bit of a social butterfly, and she had already called him 10 times asking when he'd come home." We all thought it was a little strange but still laughed it off. We were about to leave when the bartender stopped us. "No, no, dearies, it's best you stay a little longer. The shouting outside is them arguing, and I can tell she's not happy with you guys for keeping him so late. And I should warn you, it wouldn't be the first time she shot at someone for keeping him out too long. It's better if you wait until they leave," she said. So, we stuck around for about 30 more minutes, hearing them argue outside. Finally, we heard a car start and saw a white truck speed off, followed by a second truck chasing after it. The roads were narrow and winding, and both trucks were speeding like crazy. The bartender casually said, "She drives our kids to school on the bus, you know." We couldn't help but think this would never happen back home. If I ever find myself in that area again, I'd definitely go back to Pinehurst Lodge. Story 14. I used to work in a government office where part of our duties involved opening letters. We had a whole team dedicated to sorting through a large volume of incoming mail every day. For some unknown reason, a person who seemed to be in a disturbed state of mind started sending letters with something unpleasant inside. It was likely a form of protest or retaliation, though I can't say for sure. This went on for weeks, possibly months. For safety reasons, certain departments had to wear gloves and face masks to handle these special letters. One day, I found myself tasked with opening one of these unsettling envelopes. This time, however, it was different. Along with the unpleasant contents, something shiny fell out of the envelope. Curious, I carefully cleaned it using hand sanitizer and paper towels. To my surprise, it was a small, round piece of metal, gold, I believe. The item turned out to be a coin from the 17th or 19th century, and though it's not worth a fortune, it's still a curious artifact. While the value of the coin is modest, it's by far the most bizarre and unusual story I have from my time working in that office. And that, kids, is how I ended up with a gold coin sent in a rather unusual package. Story 15. My dad went to secondary school with John Lennon and was a few years older than him. He was known for his musical talents, especially playing the drums. One day, John asked him if he'd like to be the drummer in a band he was forming. My dad was excited about the opportunity, but my grandmother insisted he focus on his studies, so he decided not to join. The band went on to form the Quarrymen, and I think a guy named Colin ended up being the drummer instead of my dad. Later on, Pete Best took over, and then Ringo Starr as the band evolved into the Silver Beatles, and eventually the Beatles. Sometimes, I like to imagine an alternate reality where my dad said yes to the offer. Even though I wouldn't have been born in that version of events, I think he would have truly deserved that incredible journey. Story 16. A few years ago, I was hitchhiking north of Richmond, Virginia, when a car with two guys pulled over to give me a ride. We started chatting, and it turned out they were heading to a friend's place to do some target shooting. They asked if I wanted to join them. I hesitated and asked if their friend would be okay with a stranger showing up to shoot guns, to which one of them replied, "Just tell him you're my cousin from Seattle." So, instead of staying stranded on the side of the highway in the blistering heat, I spent the afternoon enjoying hamburgers, shooting targets, and setting off explosions with bags of tannerite on some random DoD employee's private land. I don't remember your name, man, but you made it an unforgettable experience. Thanks for the amazing memory. Story 17. I enjoy cycling a lot, so whenever I get the chance, I ride my bike out of the city and into the hills to push myself with some challenging climbs. One day, after riding up and down a steep mountain, I was heading back towards the city center. I was pretty tired, still having about 40 kilometers to go. Suddenly, I saw traffic on the other side of the road was stopped for some reason. What I saw next totally surprised me. There, in my lane, was an ostrich running after the car ahead of me. It was bizarre since ostriches aren't native to the area I live in. I cautiously followed the ostrich for a bit, unsure of what to do. Should I try to pass it? I wasn't an ostrich expert, but I remembered that they can run fast and sometimes act aggressively toward people. I didn't want to risk getting attacked by one, but at the same time, I was eager to finish my ride before it got dark. After a brief moment of hesitation, I decided to pass the ostrich. Fortunately, I made it home without any issues. Even though nothing dramatic happened, it's still one of the most surreal things I've experienced on a bike ride. Story 18. When I was in university, I didn't have a car, so getting around with friends was often a hassle. I would find myself stumbling home late at night or in the early hours of the morning, waiting for the first train, and trying to make my way home. One evening, I was visiting some friends, and the only way back home at that hour, it must have been between 1 and 2 a.m., was a train that took a rural route. My stop was next to a small forest and a 13th-century-style castle. I was familiar with the area because I used to play around there when I was a kid. The path home involved walking through some fields, past the stables where horses were kept, through a patch of woods, then along a narrow road between two fields, past an eerie, abandoned gatekeeper's house, and finally to a bridge where I could rejoin civilization. There were no lights anywhere. Although I was a bit drunk, I figured I knew the path well enough to walk it in the dark. I debated waiting for the next bus, but that would take hours. The weather was nice, so I decided to go for it. Everything went smoothly until I reached the slope. As soon as I descended, it was pitch black. On my left was the dense forest, and on my right, a hill blocked out the moon. I couldn't even see my own feet. I was stumbling along in the dark, trying not to trip over roots or branches, and every sound made me think something horrible was about to happen. I kept telling myself it was fine, recalling a lesson from a former teacher who had said that forests are actually safer at night. After all, what kind of dangerous person would be waiting for a victim out there in the middle of nowhere? That thought helped me calm down a bit. Eventually, the moon reappeared, and I could see the abandoned house in the distance. I was feeling pretty proud of myself for making it through when, out of nowhere, someone jumped out from the woods into my path. It was so sudden, I didn't even have time to scream. It was a jogger, in full gear, running through the woods at night without any light. He just zoomed past me like it was the most normal thing in the world. I made it home safely, but after that, I promised myself I would never do that walk again. A week later, though, I found myself doing the same thing, minus the jogger. I honestly have no idea how I made it past 30. Story 19. My father used to live in Kazakhstan around 2006 for work. One evening, he was at a bar with a colleague when a tall, muscular Russian man walked in. The man decided he wanted to sit near my dad, but instead of finding an empty chair, he went straight to one that a small woman was sitting in and literally tossed her off it, saying he wanted the chair. My dad saw this and immediately spoke up, saying, "Hey man, what are you doing?" The Russian man then turned to him and said, "I'm going to beat you up when you leave this place." My father wasn't too concerned at first, but then he noticed that the Russian man's friends started arriving, about 4 large men inside, and another 4 outside. That's when my dad started to get worried. As the managing director of the company in Kazakhstan at the time, he decided to call the head of security, HOS, for help. The HOS told my dad to stay put at the bar and wait for him to arrive. After some tense moments and awkward conversation with his work colleague, around 30 bodyguards started pouring into the bar. They made a human wall between my dad and the exit, with many of them carrying pistols, given the country they were in. Once the HOS arrived, he escorted my dad to his car, but not before 2 black BMWs pulled up to escort him home. It wasn't the most outrageous story, but hearing my dad tell it was pretty wild. He also mentioned that the temptation to flip off the Russian guys was huge, but he didn't want to risk it. Story 20. This happened in either the late 90s or early 2000s. So, my granddad once had a fling with a woman from Kiribati while on holiday. It resulted in a child, my aunt. A few years ago, my family decided to visit her in Kiribati. For those who don't know, it's located on the equator. To get there, we had to take a small 50-seater twin-prop plane from Fiji, with 1 toilet at the front of the cabin. As a kid with multiple food allergies, I had eaten something that didn't agree with me, and I started feeling mildly sick. About 30 minutes into the flight, my stomach made it clear that something was coming, and I rushed to the toilet. As I was walking down the aisle, things took a turn. What I thought was a harmless fart turned into full-blown diarrhea. By the time I reached the toilet and locked the door, I couldn't hold it anymore. I had an accident and my underwear was completely soaked. I didn't want to clog the toilet, so I threw my undies in the trash and did my best to clean up. But the amount that came out, plus the toilet paper I had to use, ended up clogging the toilet anyway. And it smelled really bad. I was in there for about 15 minutes, and by the time I came out, the entire plane had started to stink. I did my best to clean up, but the toilet was completely out of order and starting to overflow. I slowly walked back to my seat with everyone staring at me. Quick note. Back then, airplane toilets used a mix of water and chemicals to flush. When the toilet is blocked, there's nowhere for the waste to go, and no vacuum to suck it down. The more you press the flush, the more chemicals get pumped in, but with the toilet blocked, it starts overflowing. I had to confess to my dad what had happened, and he spoke to the flight attendants, who had to deal with the mess. The toilet water was starting to spill onto the floor, and it was awful. When we finally landed in Kiribati, the plane had to be grounded while they cleaned and disinfected it. The heat from outside made the situation even worse, and the plane was delayed for quite a while. I only remember this because my dad brought it up the other day. He thought I had put my undies in the toilet, which caused the blockage, but I had to assure him it was all toilet paper and waste that did the damage. Story 21. I was traveling in Honduras with a girl I was seeing, along with her sister and some other friends, and we were staying in a hostel. During the September 15th celebrations in a small town, there were a lot of festivities, so we decided to go out and enjoy the day. Later in the evening, on our way back to the hostel, we started getting a bit more affectionate. We were kissing in the town plaza, and while we couldn't head back to the hostel for privacy since our friends were there, the plaza was dark and had some columns and secluded spots. We decided to take advantage of the privacy and continue. As things progressed, we found ourselves in between 2 columns, and she was leaning back against one. After a little while, she started shaking and had this strange look on her face. At first, I thought she was having the most intense reaction ever, but then I started feeling a strange sensation in my legs. It took me a moment, but then I realized it was electricity. I was being shocked through my legs, and when I looked at her, I realized she was being shocked too. I immediately pulled us both to the side and looked at the column she had been leaning against. Turned out there were exposed wires coming out of it. She was really shaken up, thinking she was in danger and couldn't move. We both calmed down eventually, but it was definitely one of the most unexpected and alarming things to happen. Story 22. When I was 22, I had an internship with the marketing department at Buffalo Wild Wings. During that time, I was also running a lot. Every time I went for a run, I would text my girlfriend to let her know I was heading out, just to make sure someone knew where I was. One day, in the middle of my run, I got a text from her asking for a special picture when I got back. I agreed, and then shortly after, I received a text from my female boss asking if I had sent out some paperwork, which I had already done. When I got home, I was exhausted and just wanted to shower, but I remembered the special picture request. So, reluctantly, I took a bathroom mirror selfie from head to knee and sent it with a kiss face emoji. About an hour later, I received a text from my girlfriend. "Did you forget my special picture?" Sad face. I was confused. I thought I had already sent it. So, I went back into my texts. And then it hit me. Oh no. I had sent the picture to my boss by mistake. My heart dropped. I immediately tried to fix it by texting her, apologizing and explaining that it wasn't meant for her. I even took a screenshot of the conversation with my girlfriend to prove it was a mistake. But there was no response. The next day, I went into the office and my worst fear came true. I was called into HR and fired. It was a horrible feeling because I had really enjoyed the internship. But, hey, it makes for a good story now. Story 23. When I was 19, I would occasionally help a friend by delivering packages for him. One of my regular clients worked at the local zoo. One day, we decided to hang out behind the indoor penguin enclosure and smoke. After we finished, we went inside the zoo to check on the penguins, and they were acting very strangely. It turned out we had been smoking right next to the air intake for the penguin enclosure. And that was the day I accidentally hotboxed some penguins. Story 24. Around 19 years ago, when I was 3 years old, my parents and I came home to find that our cat, Nubs, was missing. We searched the entire apartment, but there was no sign of her. My mom made missing posters, even though all the doors and windows were locked. Days turned into weeks, and then months passed without any news. Eventually, she had to accept that Nubs was gone. Fast forward to last year, out of the blue, my grandma casually mentions that she lost Nubs. Apparently, while we were out shopping, she had gone to the mall across the street and used the baby stroller to carry extra bags. While in the middle of the mall, Nubs, who was sleeping in the stroller, suddenly woke up and jumped out of the bottom mesh pouch, running off. My grandma, not knowing what to do, left the store and never asked for help. We got home about half an hour later and continued searching, unaware of what had actually happened. My mom, who had helped us look, was devastated when she finally found out. It's such an emotional realization now. After all those years of wondering, we finally got the answer. Story 25. During the summer between my junior and senior year of college, I went to pick up a friend from a guy's house. It turned out that the guy who provided some of our group's weed was there, and everyone was very high. The parents weren't home, but the house was full of the smell of marijuana. I had an internship that required drug testing, so even though I wanted to join in, I couldn't. I was the only sober one there, and kept trying to convince my friend to leave with me to avoid any trouble. As we were about to leave, the host's dog started acting strangely near the bathroom. The guy who usually dealt with the weed went to check, and came back to tell us there was a possum in the bathroom. At first, we didn't believe him, but when we went to look, sure enough, there was a possum hanging inside. The dealer came up with the idea of using a broom to gently push the possum into a dog crate, and surprisingly, it worked. The next problem was what to do with the possum. Somehow, they ended up accidentally hot-boxing the possum in the front hallway by trapping it in the crate. I managed to get my friend out of there just in time. Less than 15 minutes later, the parents came home to find a high possum in a cage, surrounded by their very stoned son and his friends. They never believed the possum just wandered in on its own, probably through the dog door. Fortunately, my friend and I escaped without any issues. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.